Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance from author Indiana Wake. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. Welcome to the Carter Sisters series, a sweet and inspirational romance series where courage is tested, faith is strengthened, and love finds a way. Copyright Indiana Wake. Twins for a Lonely Bride by Indiana Wake. Chapter 1. Reed Masters isn't so bad, Victoria. Elizabeth Carter looked hopefully at her older sister. I'd never thought I'd be married, Elizabeth, and now that I find that I am, I wish it could have been to a man of my own choosing. I wish it was anything other than being lost in a card game. Victoria Carter bit her lip, but she could have cried at the injustice of it. She never thought she would marry, and that was the truth. The oldest of 5 sisters, she'd acted like a mama to them for as long as she could remember. Since their own mama had passed away giving birth to Constance, the youngest of her sisters, who was now just 18 years old. Victoria, who'd been just 8 years old herself at the time, had felt the weight of responsibility fall heavily upon her shoulders from that very first day. Jack Carter, far from helping his daughters find their way in a motherless life, simply ignored them. Often he acted as if they were a burden to him. He had never spared them a moment's concern from the day of their mama's funeral, and had just assumed that it was 8-year-old Victoria's lot in life to surrender her childhood and bring up the 4 little ones for him. Victoria, why on earth would you never have been married? Elizabeth asked with the sweetest smile. Oh, you know why, honey. No, I don't. Well, I'm not exactly the prettiest girl in town, now am I? Victoria said the words, and feeling heat hit her cheeks, she looked down into her lap. Victoria and Elizabeth were sitting in the clean but Spartan kitchen in the home they were soon to lose. Their father, a man who'd always had nothing but his gambling debts and poor temper to recommend him, had lost so badly at the card tables that his house and everything in it was already owned by another man. Deciding that he would try to win a little money from a lesser card player in the hope of paying back all he owed, Jack Carter simply ended up losing again. With nothing left to give, he'd just handed his eldest daughter in marriage to the man he lost that final game to. Reed Masters. That's just not true, Victoria. You're beautiful. Thank you, Elizabeth. That's just so sweet of you to say something like that. Victoria brightened a little. And I'm not getting myself all upset over it. It just is as it is. I've always been just a little too heavy, and this scar on my face doesn't help things. Her hand went to her left cheek as if it had a life of its own. Don't worry, I'm long past mourning a pretty face, really I am. That scar is hardly noticeable. To you, Victoria said with a sigh. Because you're so used to seeing it. But to someone new, it stands out. I can just tell it by the looks on folks' faces. When Victoria had been just 18, she'd slipped and fallen from a chair in their little kitchen as she tried to hang some new pretty drapes she'd just finished sewing. She'd landed badly, hitting her face hard on the side of the iron range, and the soft skin of her cheek had opened wide and deep. The scar had never faded, and Victoria had always felt herself very aware of it, even if she tried to play it down to her sisters. Well, you're beautiful no matter what you say, Elizabeth went on, quite determined. Thank you. Victoria smiled, warmed by her sister's affection. And I don't hear Reed Masters complaining. When Daddy offered you as his bride, he was only too quick to accept. Elizabeth smiled hopefully again. I know, but I hardly think it's true love, Elizabeth. The man's been a widower for nearly a year now. I reckon he will have already been looking out for a new bride to take care of those babies of his. That's what happens, I guess. But if he didn't want you, he'd have turned Daddy down. That's my point, Victoria. I don't think Mr. Masters married for love the first time around either. I reckon I heard he picked his first wife out of the matrimonial advertisements in the newspaper so that he could get to starting a family before it was too late. Is that so bad? A man wanting some sons to pass his business on to? No, it's not so bad. And I guess he just found it a little difficult to meet someone in the normal way. That ranch of his is pretty big and would take up a lot of his time, Victoria said, shaking her head in understanding. Not to mention the fact he's awful quiet. I don't think I've ever seen him dance at the barn dance, or even talk to a lady now I come to think of it, Elizabeth added. I guess he is kind of quiet. That will be how come he didn't find a bride until he was more than 30. But that doesn't mean you won't be happy. If you just find a way to come to know him, everything might work out nice. And if I don't, then I'll be unhappy forever. Victoria sighed. Still, I guess a life all alone wasn't going to be too happy either. I reckon I swing between being afraid and thinking I have nothing to lose in the first place. Victoria shrugged. Well, you'll never lose us. You'll always have your sisters. Elizabeth reached across the small wooden table and held her sister's hand. You know, I was always so frustrated with this tiny table, trying to get all the plates on it and too many chairs around it. Now I look at it and I know I'll miss it. It makes me want to cry, Victoria said, her voice already starting to break. Me too. I don't want us to lose our home, but it's already too late. Daddy's never going to find a way to get it all back now. Especially from all the way over in Hackett Falls, if that's really where he went to. Victoria frowned. Jack Carter, knowing that he had many other gambling debts in Murray Plains to service, had decided to leave town. He'd signed the house over and his small piece of land already and, without any thought to how his remaining 4 daughters would survive, he simply headed off, claiming he had some work a few towns over. Since he'd left for Hackett Falls, the girls had heard nothing from him. You're right. We have no choice, Victoria said, and finally she allowed a single tear to escape and roll slowly down her cheek to land on the table that she would miss as much as her home. Chapter 2. So, the minister says we can be wed any day this week, Reed Masters spoke gruffly. Whatever suits you. There's just a couple of things I need to discuss with you first, Mr. Masters, Victoria began somewhat cautiously. She had a plan, but she needed his agreement. Reed Masters, taking the bull by the horns, had attended what was to be the Carter family home for just a few more days. Standing in the kitchen, he'd seemed as quiet and awkward as Victoria always remembered him to be. Of course, they had never been particularly well acquainted. They would pass at church on Sundays and she would see him at the occasional barn dance at which he never spoke. However, his reserved nature had been clear to her for some time, as had the fact that his short marriage had not seemed to be a particularly happy one. Reed's first wife had been nearer his own age. She had been widowed without children and, finding herself on hard times since her husband's sad demise, she'd advertised for matrimony. Nobody had been particularly surprised when Reed had married the woman. After all, it seemed unlikely he would ever work out how to find a bride on his own. And what's that? Reed asked, his face entirely emotionless. Mr. Masters, I can't simply come to your home and abandon my 4 sisters to nothing. I'm sure you're aware that my pa lost everything, the house included. He sure was a poor player at times, Reed agreed. I reckon the men of this town knew it well. The problem is, they were taking from my sisters and me as much as they were taking from my pa. The gambling men of this town helped to make 5 women homeless. Well, I guess I had a part in that too, Reed said, and she was quite surprised he hadn't put up more of an argument. "Well, I know you only sat down to play cards with him when he had nothing left to lose. Nothing of value, at any rate. So, I was not blaming you, Mr. Masters, for the situation my sisters and I now find ourselves in. Perhaps, if we're to be wed, you could just call me Reed." "Yes. But you might not want to get married when you find out that I need to bring my sisters with me." She paused and, seeing no expression on his face she could work with, Victoria simply had to continue. "Not forever, you understand, just until I have found husbands for them." "All of them?" Reed asked, a little cautiously for her liking. "I cannot get married and live in comfort knowing that my sisters are destitute. I realize you won me fair and square, but a man cannot really use his daughter as a stake in a card game. Not in law, Mr. Masters." "I know that," he said quietly. "I'm not trying to blackmail you, Mr. Masters. I'm simply looking out for my sisters the same way I have always done since my mama died. They're all pretty girls. It won't take long to find them good husbands. Then you can bring them with you. I guess it's more hands to help at the end of the day. And my sisters sure do work hard. We all do. As long as you make the babies your priority, then the home, you can set your sisters to do whatever you wish. They'll have to share 2 rooms between the 4 of them. It's all I've got apart from my own bedroom and the room that the babies sleep in." "That sounds just fine, Mr. Masters." Victoria nodded, feeling entirely relieved. "Reed," he said, and looked down at his feet. "Reed," Victoria said and smiled. "Now then, won't you take a seat here and let me fix you some pie and coffee? It's apple and berries." "Well, that sure sounds real nice, thank you," Reed said, and ceased leaning on the wall to take a seat at the tiny kitchen table. As she set to work, Victoria contemplated Reed Masters a little more closely than she had ever done before. He was now about 33 or 4 years old and looked every bit of it. Still, a man who worked outside all day in the Idaho sunshine always tended to look his age. His skin had been tanned by the constant sun too. In truth, Victoria thought the tan suited him nicely. He had brown hair with sweeps of gold in it where the sun had taken the color right out. His eyes were a nice bright blue. Reed was a man who many women failed to notice, but Victoria reckoned that was because he was so quiet and reserved. He wasn't a drinker at all and not seen about much in the town of Murray Plains. His ranch was on the very edge, out on its own in a great swathe of flat lands before the hills got started in the distance. And yet, as she looked at him as she placed a plate of pie down on the table, Victoria realized that there was something kind of handsome about him. Not handsome in a common sense, but really very strong and attractive nonetheless. Maybe things could work out nice in the end, just like Elizabeth had said. Maybe they would even find some common ground between them, or even some happiness. Of course, keeping a roof over her sisters' heads had been her main priority and Victoria had already achieved that. She knew she must be grateful for such mercies in this world and, in the end, if love and romance didn't come, she knew enough about life to know that she had never been owed it in the first place. Chapter 3. I know things had to get rough for us to come here, but I just love this place. Gabriella, the middle of the 5 sisters, had been unable to hide her pleasure in the place from the moment they had moved in. "Well, I sure am glad you're happy here, honey," Victoria said and smiled. The rest of the girls had taken a little more convincing. It wasn't that their old home had been any better than the ranch, it was just that everything was changing and they felt a sudden shift in the securities of life. Victoria knew it was entirely understandable, after all, she'd felt something similar herself. And how do you like being a married woman? Elizabeth asked, raising her eyebrows as Gabriella and Gillian squeaked and giggled. I reckon you shouldn't be asking such a thing. Constance, the youngest of all the Carter girls, was the most sensitive and perhaps just a little more rigorous in her adherence to the good book. Oh, come on, Constance, Elizabeth said and chuckled. No, leave her be, Victoria said, stepping into their little quarrel like she always did. I'm going down to the church anyway. I told Pastor Elliot I'd put some nice new flowers in ready for tomorrow's service, Constance said, sounding a little annoyed. Well, let me ride down with you. I could do with a bit of air, Gillian said, smiling and trying to get Constance back on her side again. Yes, all right, Constance said, not sounding very convincing. When the two younger Carter girls had put on their shawls and set off for Murray Plains town, Elizabeth immediately turned her attention back to Victoria. Well, you never answered. She looked mischievous. I think Constance had a point there, Elizabeth. You shouldn't have been asking. Oh, come on, Victoria. She's just curious, Gabriella said, looking every bit like she was about to burst out laughing. All right, if I'm absolutely honest, I can't answer your question. I don't know what married life is like, Victoria said, and felt her cheeks flush with rejection and shame. What do you mean? You've been married for 2 weeks, Elizabeth said, clearly not choosing her words too cautiously. Of course you know what married life is like. No, Elizabeth, I really do not. Victoria did not want to have to spell it out. In truth, she had felt humiliated enough when it was nothing more than a secret that only she and Reed knew. Elizabeth, Gabriella said, just a little too late. Oh. I mean, sorry, Elizabeth said, her cheeks flushing and her eyes glassy with apologetic tears. I shouldn't have said anything. Look, girls, you weren't to know how things really are. I guess I don't really understand it myself. But ever since I got here, I've been sleeping on the little bed in the nursery room with Ellie and Jess. But why? Elizabeth asked, striding into the breach once more. I don't really know why. It's just that from the day of our wedding onwards, that's where I've slept. Reed showed me in there on our first night. I mean, he made sure it was comfortable and all, but it wasn't really what I was expecting. Victoria looked down sadly. Although, I guess I probably should have expected it, shouldn't I? No, Elizabeth said, the emotion clear in her voice. Not this again. You're more than good enough for Reed Masters as a wife, not just a mother to his children. Well, maybe it'll just take him a little time to see if an attraction comes to him. And it might never come to him, and I guess I've just got to prepare myself for that. Victoria could have cried in her anguish. From their very first night together, the night where she thought after so many years that she would finally become a woman, Reed had shown her into the larger room that his children slept in. There were 2 big cots, one for each of the 2-year-old twin girls. And then there was a bed. A small bed just for one. There was a really pretty floral bedspread on it and lots of cushions. In truth, it looked to Victoria like Reed had gone to a good deal of effort to make her welcome in his home. But welcome as a new mother to his children, not as a new wife to be welcomed into his bed and, eventually, his heart. Then, when he'd left her alone in that room with the little ones who were already asleep, he had smiled at her so kindly that Victoria felt it had made things all very much worse. It was almost as if he felt sorry for her and the life he was confining her to. A marriage without love of any kind, physical or emotional. Of course, his seeming rejection of her might well have been due to a number of causes. And yet she could not think of a single one which would explain it better than the fact that he was simply not attracted to a somewhat heavy woman with a great scar on her face. So, she had ended her wedding day feeling absolutely desolate. The one event she had been worrying about for days in advance had not come to pass and, in its absence, she had felt entirely bereft. As she lay on top of the beautiful floral bedspread, still fully clothed, Victoria wept for everything that had not happened. At that moment, she would have swapped her sadness for her young bride's fear without hesitation. The little fear she had felt in the run-up to her wedding had been nothing compared to the almost physical pain of rejection. Anyway, it's nothing for you girls to worry about. We're all here and we're all together and things could have been so very much worse, Victoria said, doing what she always did. In truth, turning her attention to the needs of her younger sisters always took her mind off of her own problems and, if that's what it took forevermore, then that's what she would do. Chapter 4. Reed's little girls were delightful. Ellie and Jess were 2 years old and just about the cutest little girls Victoria had ever seen. They had pale blonde hair, just as their mama had, if Victoria's memory served her well. In truth, beyond a general sense that the previous Mrs. Masters had not been a particularly happy woman, Victoria could hardly remember the finer details of her appearance at all. And there had never really been a need for it, since the Masters family and the Carter family were not particularly acquainted. The one thing that Victoria could not escape was the sadness she felt at the thought of the poor woman dying when her babies were just 1 year old. She had never seen them running about as they did now from room to room at top speed. She hadn't seen their hair growing or their limbs lengthening and losing just a little of the baby fat. And she had never had any sort of meaningful, even if childish, conversation with her girls. Victoria thought that was just about the saddest thing in the world, and she remembered well the death of her own mama all those years ago. She knew that, of all her sisters, she had the finest and clearest memory of their mother. Poor Constance obviously didn't stand a chance of holding anything of the woman who had died on the day she herself had been born. And Jillian, who had only been 2, and Gabriella, who had barely been 4, seemed hardly better able to remember anything than Constance did. Elizabeth, who had been 5 when their mother died, had the very vaguest recollection of the beautiful dark-haired lady who had graced their lives for so short a time. But, at 8 years old, Victoria had formed such lasting memories of her mother as to be able to recall her face in detail. She often wished that she could draw and sketch as well as Gabriella, for she could then, at least, give her 4 sisters an idea of what their dear mother had looked like. As it was, she could only ever describe her. The only thing that she could tell them for sure was that their mama had hair identical to Victoria's own. For as much as she lacked confidence in every other aspect of her appearance, Victoria always felt a little pride in her long, chocolate brown curls. Her hair always gleamed with health, and she couldn't think of another woman in all of Murray Plains who had hair of such a rich color. Still, she knew that thoughts of her own mother would never help the 2 little girls running around her in the sitting room to remember their own. They were just 2 more little girls to whom the face of their own mama was a mystery and always would be. "Hey, Jess, you put that down now," Victoria said with a laugh when she saw the little girl reaching for her daddy's hat. It was a brown, broad-brimmed hat which, more often than not, Reed forgot to take with him when he set off for the ranch lands in the mornings. Little Jess refused to put the hat down and, grinning, wobbled her way across the rug which Victoria and Ellie were sitting on and playing with some little dolls. Holding the hat out in her tiny, chubby fists, Jess placed it squarely on Victoria's head. "Well now, I don't think your daddy would be too pleased to see me wearing his hat," Victoria said and laughed. However, she didn't remove the hat immediately. The girls were so thrilled and amused to see it on her head that she didn't want to deny them their little pleasure. "Well, if I'm going to wear your daddy's hat," I need to find something to dress you baby girls up in. What do you say? Yeah, Jess shouted enthusiastically. Yeah, Ellie said in adorable babyish tones. She was definitely the quieter of the twins. Right, let's see what we can find. Victoria lifted each one of them onto the couch. Now, you girls stay put while I go and find something to dress you up in. In no time at all, Victoria returned with the straw bonnet that Constance always wore for church and a beautiful pink shawl that Elizabeth had passed down to Gabriella years ago. The girls were so excited that they slid down from the couch and were standing on the rug in front of her. Victoria first put the bonnet on Ellie's head and then, once she had secured the ribbons, turned her attention upon Jess. Jess was practically wriggling with excitement as Victoria placed the shawl over her head and wrapped it around her shoulders. There now, what do you think of our new dressing-up clothes? Victoria asked, and laughed at the amusement and excitement of the beautiful little girls. Good, Jess said, and Ellie just smiled. Now, where should we go in our new outfits? Victoria asked with a broad grin. After all, you girls look so pretty it would be a shame to just stand here on the rug. Maybe we should go outside for a while. You look pretty too, Ellie said in a tiny voice, and Victoria felt a little tightening in her throat. Well, that sure is nice of you, sweetie, she said, and heard the faintest tremor of emotion in her voice. Go outside, Jess said, all ready to set off across the rug. All right, let's do that, Victoria said and made to stand. Daddy. The girls said in unison when they saw Reed silently standing in the sitting room doorway. Oh, Reed, Victoria said, wondering just how long he had been standing there. In truth, she felt a little self-conscious. We played dress up, Daddy, Ellie said in the same tiny voice she had used on Victoria. And don't you just look as pretty as a little ladybug, Reed said and scooped Ellie up into his arms. And me, Daddy, Jess said, almost running on the spot with her arms up in the air and the pink shawl sliding down and covering one eye. And you too. You look as pretty as a little ladybug, just like your sister, Reed said, and scooped Jess up in the other arm. And Toria pretty too, Ellie said, her cheeks pink as she smiled at Victoria. For a moment, Victoria wished herself anywhere else on earth. She just didn't want to hear what Reed had to say next. Or, worse still, she didn't want to hear the awkward silence she felt sure would come. She sure is, Reed said without skipping a beat. I reckon Daddy's hat suits her better, huh? He said, and laughed a little. Victoria hadn't seen him laugh at all in the weeks since they had been married, and she was strangely unsettled by it. Not knowing what to do or say, she simply smiled and took Reed's hat from her head, laughing lightly as she placed it on his own head. I guess you better take it back before you lose it, she said with an amusement she wasn't really sure she felt and a strange warm feeling in her stomach. Chapter 5. I can't help thinking that Reed seems a little bit more settled these last couple of weeks, Victoria. Elizabeth, who was peeling potatoes at the kitchen table, spoke quietly. Honestly, I don't know, Victoria said truthfully. I guess I'm kind of learning not to come to expect anything in all of this. I just hate that you have to think that way, Elizabeth said, clearly distressed. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel glum. Victoria sat down with a great bowl of broad beans for shelling. I'll do those for you, Victoria. After all, you've got the girls. The girls who are now, finally, sound asleep, Victoria said and smiled as she peered in through the open doorway to the sitting room where Ellie and Jess were sprawled on the couch, their little arms around each other. They've worn themselves out completely today, she went on. They are real lively little girls, aren't they? Elizabeth smiled and laughed. I wonder if we were quite so lively at that age. No, I don't think we were, Victoria said, sadly. I think things were just a little bit more somber in our house. Because we lost our mama, Elizabeth said and nodded. But Ellie and Jess have lost their mama also, she added. I know, but they didn't lose their daddy too. We didn't lose our pa, Elizabeth said, seeming confused. I guess not. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that we never had much of a daddy to start with. Ellie and Jess cannot be in any doubt that their daddy loves them. Oh yes, I would agree with that. It's the only time his face ever lights up, when he looks at them little babies, Elizabeth said and chuckled. When Victoria didn't respond, Elizabeth realized her error. Oh, I am so sorry. I didn't mean it was the only time his face ever lights up. I didn't mean that you. Oh, I'm so sorry. Elizabeth ground to a halt and looked down as she stopped peeling the potatoes. You have nothing to be sorry for, Elizabeth, Victoria said sadly. I guess I shouldn't be so sensitive about it. I have to keep reminding myself that we are here and we are all together with a roof over our heads. I have a wonderful life, security, and safety for you all and those amazing girls. As I said before, I'm not exactly owed love and romance. Nobody is, I guess. But he seems to be relaxing in your company now. That's something, surely? Elizabeth was, as ever, hopeful. Yes, I'm sure it is, Victoria said, unable, for some reason, to make any pretense at contentment. During the weeks since they had been married, she had found her nightly retreat to the nursery a constant source of humiliation and, despite never before truly believing that she would ever have been married, Victoria felt a loss she couldn't have imagined. If only she had never been promised as a bride in the first place. It had never been something she expected and, had she been left to continue on in the same vein, she would never have a sense of deprivation at all. In truth, Victoria had always seen her life revolving around the lives of her sisters. While she knew herself to be no true beauty, she had always felt that her 4 younger sisters were really very beautiful indeed. Victoria had quite imagined that her life would have been lived out in the house she had been born in, devoting herself to finding the very best husbands for her beloved sisters and then, once they were all safely married with children of their own, helping them wherever she could. And then, of course, whether she liked the idea or not, she had always assumed that of the 5 of them it would be she who would tend to their father in his old age. Now it seemed as if everything had changed. And in truth, it ought to have been a change for the better. While she had still very much determined to find the best husbands for her sisters, it was certainly not going to be at the expense of her own matrimony. And yet, with a matrimony as hollow as the one she seemed to find herself in, Victoria could hardly wonder how it was better than a life of spinsterhood. You know, you and Reed might not be apart forever. He is not quite as made of stone as I thought he was. Gillian and I reckon that if you're patient you'll see a change in him, Elizabeth said, and it was clear that she had considered her words well. Well, I guess I have nothing but time, Victoria said sadly. And I might just as well be patient with him as not. Trying to push Reed in any way isn't going to change anything, now is it? Just wait and see what happens. Let life unfold as it might and you never know, there might be more love in it than you think. Well, that sure is a nice thought, Elizabeth. I shall think on that now, Victoria said, and truly hoped she would be able to bear it in mind when the dark lonely nights forced tears into her eyes. Chapter 6. So, how's married life treating you, Reed? Gus Martin, the longest-serving ranch hand Reed had, was also his best friend. Gus was 10 years older than Reed and had worked for Reed's daddy on the ranch since Reed himself had been no more than 8 years old. He'd always looked up to Gus and, for his part, Gus had always looked out for him as a brother. "I don't know." "All right, I guess." "The girls are happy," Reed said, not really knowing how to answer. "Is that it? What about you?" "I'm happy if my girls are happy." "You know me." Reed smiled. "Yeah, I reckon I know you about as well as anybody. Well enough to know that you need to put yourself first for once. Jess and Ellie are well looked after. You've done your job there, Reed. But what about you? Don't you get along with Victoria at all?" "I guess I would if I hadn't pushed her away from the very first," Reed said, hearing his own thoughts out loud for the first time. "Pushed her away, how?" Gus asked, not standing on ceremony at all as he took off his brown, broad-brimmed hat and scratched his head. Reed, in a somewhat embarrassed tone, told Gus Martin how he'd led Victoria to the nursery bed the first night of their married lives. "Why? What on earth for?" Gus asked, dumbfounded. "I thought it was the best thing for both of us." Victoria hadn't been looking for a husband, had she? Her daddy flung her into it when he lost her at cards. "I guess so," Gus said, inspecting the brim of his hat before returning it to his head. "Well, I wasn't exactly looking for romance, was I? I needed a ma for the girls and I'd made no secret of that to Victoria. I guess I thought to take her to my bed when I'd told her exactly why I wanted her as a wife would have been kind of disrespectful." "I see what you mean," Gus said, although he actually seemed a little unsure. "So, tell me, how did Victoria take it?" "Victoria?" Reed asked with a sigh. "Well, to be honest, I'm not sure. She was kind of quiet, but she's a quiet sort of woman." "And did you tell her why you're sleeping in separate rooms?" "No, I guess I kind of thought she'd understand it all. If I'm completely honest, Gus, I thought she would be relieved. Even now, I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was still the case." Reed shrugged. More than once when the two of them had parted at the top of the stairs so that she might head off for the nursery and he for his bedroom, Reed had wanted to reach out and take her hand. In the beginning, he felt sure that she turned to watch him as he walked away along the corridor to his own room. He'd never actually seen her do it, but he could have sworn he'd felt it. However, it had been a long time since he'd felt that curious feeling and he couldn't help but think that Victoria now did not bother to look at him at all. "You know, you could be really very wrong here, Reed. I mean, your consideration in the matter is commendable and all, but the sort of marriage you're offering isn't really the sort of marriage a young woman really wants," Gus said and raised his eyebrows. "If you know what I mean." "I know what you mean, Gus," Reed said and laughed at the faintly comical look on his friend's face. "But if she was never interested in me in the first place, Gus, wouldn't a change in our sleeping arrangements now just rock the boat? Wouldn't it just upset things? You're assuming that Victoria doesn't want to share your bed, right?" Gus said rather bluntly. "Yeah, I guess so." "Well, we'll get back to that," Gus said, and leaned on the fence to stare out across the plains. "But, first things first, what do you feel about Victoria?" Gus scrutinized Reed in a way which made him feel he could only answer truthfully. "I guess I wasn't too interested at first," Reed said with a shrug. "But things change as you get to know a person, don't they? I mean, just the other day, I was watching her playing with the girls, some kind of dressing up game, you know? I get the gist. Anyways, Jess was wrapped in a shawl and Ellie was wearing one of the sisters' bonnets that was too big for her." He paused for a moment and smiled at the memory of it. "And Victoria was playing too." She was wearing my hat, this one, he said, raising it and replacing it quite unnecessarily. And? Gus asked when Reed had paused for just a little too long for his liking. And with that great mane of hair she has, all shining curls, and that big smile, well, I guess I suddenly realized how beautiful she is. Well now, that sure is a start, Gus Martin said, and slapped him hard on the back. That's a start, Reed. It will only get better from here, you see if it don't. Reed smiled and nodded his silent thanks to Gus, all the while wondering if things really would get better after all, or if he had ruined his own chances. Chapter 7. Don't forget your food packet now, Reed, Victoria said as Reed wandered idly about the kitchen. Thank you, Victoria. Although, I guess I'm not ready to set off just yet. He smiled at her. Oh. Is there something wrong? She was instantly concerned. He always left so early in the morning that only the two of them were ever up. Even her sisters, who did not sleep late by anybody's standards, were only just waking by the time Reed left for work on the ranch. However, Victoria took her duties as a wife very seriously and never once did her new husband leave the house without either his breakfast in his belly or his lunch ready and packed. No, nothing's wrong. I just got some fence mending to do down this end and Gus is going to take care of everything else on the plains where the cattle are at the moment. I guess I'll meet him later on this afternoon, but for now I'm not really in any rush. Then can I get you another coffee? She asked, already preparing her own. Victoria always seemed to be so very busy in the morning, making sure that Reed had a full stomach and getting things ready for Jess and Ellie's breakfasts when they finally awoke. Ordinarily, it was not until that was done that she sat down to eat herself. And, having risen so much earlier than her sisters, she was always too hungry to wait for them to come and begin their own breakfasts, so she tended to eat that meal alone. The girls never complained that breakfast was not waiting for them as it used to be when they were back home, they just seemed to take it in turns to make breakfast for each other. However, in the weeks since she had been married to Reed, eating her breakfast alone day in, day out, had rather seemed to taint the days. Yes, please, if you're having one, Reed said and sat down at the kitchen table again. He'd already eaten a hearty breakfast and yet she did not want to sit at the table and eat while he had nothing. I'm doing some more bread and butter if you want a slice, she said, and was pleased when he agreed. Victoria? He asked as she buttered the thickly sliced bread. Without answering him, she just turned to look. I guess I'm not really too good at this sort of thing, but I just wondered how you were doing, he said and seemed to be greatly awkward. How am I doing? Victoria parroted back at him, not entirely sure what he meant. I guess you just don't seem too happy here. I have nothing to complain about, Reed. Really, nothing at all, she said and felt suddenly a little panicked. After all, she knew that she could never tell him how she really felt. Victoria just couldn't find the words to describe the rejection she felt night after night and how, since her feelings for him had begun to grow, the rejection seemed to have taken on a life of its own. You're happy with everything exactly as it is? Reed asked and she couldn't gauge his mood. Exactly as it is? Victoria asked, then blushed a little as she wondered if he meant their sleeping arrangements. I just want to make sure you're happy with everything. Reed seemed to be struggling terribly and, although she knew he was not a man of many words, Victoria could not help but wish he would try just a little harder to express himself. In the end, she could think of nothing to say in response. Victoria did not want to lie and say that she was happy with everything because she simply wasn't. While their marriage had been an arranged one and most definitely one of convenience, still she did not want it to continue in that vein. Now that she did have a husband and the chance of a life, she had decided that she wanted to take that opportunity with both hands and run with it. When she'd thought she would never find a husband, she had been curiously content. Or resigned, at any rate. But now that she had a husband of her own, she found that she wanted everything that went with it. She wanted to be a proper team and she wanted love. More than anything in the world, Victoria would wish that her husband could love her. You see, I guess I'm not real sure what you want from this marriage. A little bit like my last marriage, I guess there are times when I don't know really what to do or say. You see, my first wife only ever loved her first husband. When he died, I reckon something of her died with him. I knew she'd never take to me and I knew that she didn't have a choice but to marry me. I wanted to be married and I thought it was time to get started on a family. I knew she didn't want me, night after night. And I knew I wouldn't put myself through that again. Not myself, nor anybody else, he said, and Victoria could not think of a single thing to say. She could not work out if he was telling her that they would never share a bed or if he was telling her that he would like to, but he was cautious. And Victoria, for her part, was just too embarrassed and inexperienced to ask him outright. This was the moment when she could have explained how she felt, even told him how he had become more and more handsome to her as each day passed and how she had come to like his quiet ways and his steadfast manner. And she could have told him that she would have wanted, more than anything else, to sleep in his arms night after night. Well, I guess we got that straight, Reed said a little sadly after she had been silent for minutes. Thank you for the coffee. I reckon I'd better get started on the fencing. And with that, he rose and walked silently out of the kitchen. When she was sure he was gone, Victoria allowed herself to breathe again. And with the breath came the tears of sadness and frustration. How could he say that they had got things straight when nothing had changed? And how could she complain about it when she had been given her opportunity to speak up and yet had not done so? Unable to drink her coffee or eat her breakfast, Victoria simply sat down at the enormous kitchen table, rested her head in her hands and cried. Chapter 8. It had taken a week or two for things to settle between Victoria and Reed, and they seemed, in the end, to simply return to normal. As she went about her daily business, Victoria tried hard not to think about the emptiness of her marriage and the old and familiar feelings his nightly rejection stirred up within her. Victoria had never felt herself beautiful in any way but, when she had simply lived at home with her father and sisters with no expectations for future happiness at all, it had been far less of a problem. Now that she was a married woman, the idea that even her own husband did not want her seemed to make her old sadness and inadequacy grow in size and strength until it reached a point where it threatened to take her over. Can we play dress up, Toria? Jess had been full of energy all morning and something about it had helped to raise Victoria's spirits just a little. Sure we can, Victoria said, thinking that she might have to go to her own room to find more things for the girls to dress up in. Yes, Ellie said, and clapped her hands excitedly. I want to wear Daddy's hat. Oh, Ellie, I think your daddy has it on his head today. He was wearing it when he went out this morning. Victoria smiled as Ellie's cute, chubby little face dropped in disappointment. But that's what I wanted to dress up in. Ellie looked as if she wouldn't be consoled. You can wear something else, Jess said, trying to help as best she could. But I want to wear Daddy's hat, Ellie said, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. Oh dear, Victoria said, and scooped the little girl into her arms. Maybe if I hug you nice and tight that will make you feel better. Maybe. Ellie's voice came out in a tiny and almost inconsolable sob. And me, Jess said, reaching her arms up towards her. Well now, I'm not quite as strong as your daddy. I can't lift you both at once, but, if I sit here on the couch, then I can hug the both of you, Victoria said and sat down with Ellie in her arms. In no time at all, Jess had scampered up onto the couch and had burrowed in under Victoria's other arm. It was the first time that the three of them had been so close, and Victoria could not help but be moved by it. For a moment, she wondered if their real mama would have been at all happy about it. But then, of course, a real mama simply wants her babies to be loved and cherished, and if she could do nothing else for that poor, sad woman, then she would do this much. They sat on the couch, the three of them together, for some time, and Victoria wondered about Reed and his first wife. In truth, she had thought about everything he had said to her that day in the kitchen over and over again, and, despite her sadness, Victoria began to think she had an understanding of it. Reed had married in order to start a family, and his wife had married simply because her husband had died and she had nowhere else to go. The marriage fulfilled a need in both of them, and yet, for neither of them had that need been love. She thought it little wonder that Reed had, in the end, found it so very easy to live a life where his wife slept in one room and he in another. Perhaps he had simply assumed that marriage didn't really need to be loving, and he had guarded against having his second marriage run the course of his first. But in truth, it was all too confusing, and, in the end, Victoria found she did not want to think about it anymore. With both girls fast asleep, Victoria gently extricated herself from their grip and rose to her feet. While she had a quiet moment, she would make them something to eat for their lunch when they woke up. However, Jess had come to in time to see Victoria walking away, and, still in a somewhat sleepy state, she had tried to scramble after her. With a squeal, Jess fell off the couch and hit her little head hard on the wooden floorboards. For a few moments, the little girl lay motionless, and Victoria, hardly daring to breathe, feared the worst. However, by the time Victoria was kneeling at Jess' side, the child had begun to fidget and moan a little. "Open your eyes, Jess," Victoria said, one hand on either side of little Jess' face. "What's the matter with Jess?" Ellie's voice was full of fear as she peered over the edge of the couch. "She fell off the couch and bumped her head, honey," Victoria said, trying to keep the shaking from her voice. After all, she did not want to terrify the girls. Jess opened her eyes for just a moment and seemed entirely unable to focus on Victoria at all. And she did not cry either, leading Victoria to suspect that she had sustained an injury of some magnitude. "Can you speak to me, Jess?" Victoria asked and smiled at her. The little girl tried to speak, but none of her words were discernible. Her little voice seemed to come out in one great long slurred word, and it was that more than anything else which made Victoria panic. "Right, Ellie, I need you to sit down here with Jess and keep stroking her face until I get back." Ellie gently slid down from the couch and, her face still a picture of fear, she did just as Victoria asked her. "Good girl. Now, I'm just going to hitch the cart to the horse and the three of us are going to town. Are you coming back?" Ellie asked, her eyes filling with tears. "I will be just a few minutes," Victoria said, and hurriedly kissed the top of Ellie's head before getting to her feet and running for the stable. Chapter 9. It seemed like a very long day to Reed Masters, and, as he came down from the plains, he felt quite exhausted. As had been common in the last days, when he dropped down onto the path towards the ranch house, he felt a little lift in his spirits. For the first time in a long time, the ranch house felt like a home. It was true that his first wife had never been happy there, and the house had always seemed so very quiet, with both husband and wife so very reserved. Of course, when the babies came along, there was a little more life, and he had begun to think that he would settle down into married life in the end. However, his first wife had died before he'd had the chance to settle down, and, in truth, he believed that she would never have been happy. Her life had ended on the day that her first husband died, and there had been nothing he could have done to change that. Despite the fact that he really had wanted love, Reed had known very early on that he would not receive it in his first marriage. As much as he had not been particularly drawn to his first wife, any more than she had been drawn to him, still, he had invested a certain amount of hope in their future together. When it had all been dashed, Reed had decided that he would not put himself through such pains again. It had hurt him to know how little his first wife had felt for him, even though he himself had not fallen in love with her for a moment. But Victoria was different. If he let himself, he knew that he would love her. She had so much life in her and so much loving kindness, and there seemed to be room for everybody in her heart. The way she fiercely protected her sisters, lovingly looked after his children, and kindly looked after him and his home had been the greatest source of happiness in his world. In truth, he didn't know what he ought to do next. Reed had no idea if Victoria was pleased or dismayed by the life they currently shared. He had hoped to find out a little of her heart when the two of them had sat down together. It had taken a great deal of courage for him to get just that far. But when she had not responded, Reed had been left wondering whether Victoria simply didn't want him in the first place, or if he had upended his own chances of love by rejecting her. If only he had a clue. As he reached the stables, he was already climbing down from his horse. He could see Elizabeth looking out of the kitchen window at him, her face just as white as a sheet. With a terrible sense of foreboding, he left his horse to stand and raced into the kitchen to see what the matter was. "Elizabeth? Are you all right?" he asked, looking all about him. "Oh, Reed," she said, her voice tremulous. When she did not speak further, Reed raced into the sitting room. At that time of day, if Victoria and the children were not in the kitchen, they were generally there in the sitting room playing. When he did not see them, he felt suddenly nauseous. His first thought was that she had left him. Unable to live that life anymore, his beautiful wife had deserted him in search of something better. "Where is she?" he asked, looking at Elizabeth and willing her to speak. "Is she really so unhappy here?" "What?" Elizabeth asked, shaking her head in confusion. "Lord, if only I had told her how I felt," Reed said to himself. "Reed, what are you talking about?" "Your sisters left," he said, looking at her earnestly. "No, Victoria has not left, Reed. She's taken the wagon into town." Jess fell and bumped her head and Victoria loaded them into the wagon immediately. "She's taken them down to the doctor's office." "Oh, my lord," Reed said, holding his forehead in the palm of his hand. "Of course, if she was leaving she wouldn't take the children." "Why on earth would Victoria leave you?" Elizabeth asked, her face regaining some of its color in her exasperation to get some sense out of her brother-in-law. "Because she doesn't love me," Reed said simply. "Perhaps it would be better if you asked her that yourself," Elizabeth said, somewhat annoyed with him. "Wouldn't that just be easier?" "What?" he asked, feeling himself still to be in shock. "And what of Jess? Was she unconscious?" "No, not unconscious, just a bit confused. Anyway, my sisters have all gone down to the doctor's with them, and I said that I would wait here for you. Victoria wanted me to tell you what had happened and how sorry she was." "Right, let's go now." "Let's get down into the town," Reed said, seeming to come back to his senses suddenly. "My horse is already saddled," Elizabeth said, heading out of the kitchen. Chapter 10. "So, Mrs. Masters, it's just a little bit of concussion. There really is nothing for you to worry about, but I think I'll keep little Jess here overnight so I can watch over her." The doctor, a handsome young man in his late 20s, smiled reassuringly at her. "Oh, thank goodness," Victoria said, her eyes filling with tears of relief. "Thank the Lord Almighty." "Yes, indeed." "I think he was smiling on the little mite today," the doctor said, smiling. And thank you too, doctor, obviously. Victoria smiled, laughed, and cried all at once. I reckon your sisters will be keen to hear the good news, he said, looking towards the door which led to the waiting room. Yes, I'd better get out there. What? Gabriella said, as passionate as ever. Tell us. Jess is going to be just fine, Victoria said, taking a tired and emotional Ellie from Constance's arms as she spoke. It is just a little concussion, but the doctor wants to keep her here to watch her overnight. Oh, thank goodness, Gillian said, letting out a great sigh of relief. Oh look, Elizabeth and Reed are just tying up their horses outside, Constance said, looking at Victoria a little nervously. Girls, would you be so kind as to give Reed and me a few moments to talk? Victoria asked, thinking that she really ought to face up to things on her own and at least give Reed the chance to be angry with her without an audience. After all, he was owed that much. Of course, Gabriella said, taking her two younger sisters by the hand and leading them out into the cool evening air. Victoria watched nervously as Reed made his way to the door. Gillian had discreetly tugged at Elizabeth's arm as she had made to follow her brother-in-law inside. Reed, she's going to be just fine. She has a concussion, but the doctor says she'll be just fine. Victoria had wanted to immediately put him at his ease about his daughter's condition. As she spoke, Ellie rested against her, her head lolling on Victoria's shoulder as she slid into sleep. Well, I still appreciate you getting her straight here, Reed said, so calmly and kindly that Victoria was quite astounded. What? I mean, look, Reed, I'm so sorry. I just turned my back for a second. The girls were sleeping on the couch and I thought I'd get ahead of it all and get their bread and butter ready for lunch. But Jess woke up and tried to stand in. Hey. You don't have to explain it, Reed said, and suddenly he took her and Ellie into his arms. You're a fine ma to my babies, no question. And little ones fall now and again. There's nothing you can do about it except deal with it when it comes. And that's what you did, Victoria. That's what you always do. He continued to hold her tightly, whispering the words into her curly hair. Tears rolled down Victoria's cheeks. How she had longed for him to hold her in his arms. Thank you, she squeaked, unable to trust herself to say anything more. You know, when I walked into the house and you were gone, I thought you'd left me. And I wouldn't have blamed you. I'm not much of a catch as a husband. No. That's not true, she mumbled, and he laughed. I guess it floored me then, thinking you were gone and all. I realized then that I have come to love you, Victoria. I know you probably don't feel the same, but I reckon it's best I just tell it to you anyway. It is best, Reed, because I love you too. Victoria didn't know what was wreaking the most havoc with her emotions. Jess was going to be fine, Reed wasn't angry with her, and she was loved at last. Loved by a man she had already fallen in love with herself. Well now, hasn't that worked out just nice? Reed laughed and held her face in his hands before kissing her. Elizabeth always said it would work out just nice in the end. Victoria said. Elizabeth had been the first to rise the next morning. Everyone was tired and the emotions of the previous day had seen her three sisters sleeping in just a little. Reed and Victoria had returned with the girls just as the sun was coming up. The doctor had been happy with Jess' progress and released her so that the little family might return home and sleep. Elizabeth had helped to settle the girls down and, just as she had been about to leave her sister to get into her bed in the nursery, Reed had walked quietly into the room. Elizabeth had made herself scarce, although she'd hovered just long enough to hear two sets of footsteps making their way to Reed's bedroom down the hall. Smiling to herself, Elizabeth had wandered into the kitchen to put some coffee on. Maybe everything happened for a reason. And maybe Reed needed to think, just for a moment, that he'd lost Victoria to realize how much he loved her. Elizabeth yawned loudly, her mouth opening so wide she heard a little cracking of her jaw. Well, maybe everything happens for a reason, but I see no real reason for me to be up this early. She laughed to herself as she padded across the kitchen to the range. At that moment, she heard something from outside the door. It was a cry surely, but of what she couldn't tell. Cautiously, Elizabeth opened the door and peered out. She could see nothing out in the wide yard and wondered if it was maybe an animal from further away than she had first thought. Suddenly, a little cry came again and Elizabeth's attention was drawn down to the porch. There, in a little box just to the side of the door was a baby. "What?" Elizabeth asked in a whisper. "But what are you doing here?" she said, staring down incredulously at the tiny child. Quickly, she looked around but no one was there. So she listened but there was not a sound, no horse, no footsteps, nothing. In a state of shock, Elizabeth bent down and picked up the box. In a daze, she took the box and baby into the kitchen. Thank you for listening to the first book in author Indiana Wake's The Carter Sisters series. If you enjoyed Twins for a Lonely Bride, you'll love the second book, A Baby on the Porch. Subscribe to Indiana's YouTube channel today and be the first to know when she releases new free audiobooks.